Damon Horowitz, who's going to speak about the anatomy of a large-scale social search engine. So Damon comes to us via Columbia, MIT, and Stanford, and after a master's in AI from Media Lab, I guess, wound up being kind of briefly seduced by the dark side and doing a PhD in actual philosophy, but focusing on kind of questions around natural language, and since then has gone on to do 4 separate startups, including most recently a question and answering company that you may have interacted with called Aardvark, and that was recently acquired by Google. So he's going to tell us about experiences building Aardvark.
Thank you, Andrew. Is the mic on? Everything sounds fine? Great. So, following up on the social theme, I'm going to focus here on just one aspect of social, on social search, and within social search, on one particular new paradigm for social search, which is the Aardvark paradigm, as we call it, having named it such. This is a product that I built with my team. It's been running live now for over a year, and the material I'm going to cover today is from a white paper on Aardvark social search that I wrote with my good friend Set Kamvar, who's with us here today, for the WWW conference. So let's start with a little motivation for why one would embark on the project of coming up with a new kind of search engine. Think of this as our user, the contemporary user, confused, stressed, poorly dressed, and filled with uncertainty. Questions constantly running through the user's mind. These might be things like, when can I get out of here and take a vacation? Where should I go? Are there any good Java libraries for XMPP? How can I politely tell the person next to me that they have bad breath? Just these are the things that are constantly running through our mind. And if you think of us as stressed in a condition of total uncertainty, it's a marvel how few queries we submit to search engines. Of all the things that are passing through your mind, in the past 10 minutes, which of those questions have you then consulted a search engine for? There's a number, but it's not nearly as many as it could be. So why don't we use search engines more? So there are really 3 classes of questions that I want to focus on here as motivation for building a new kind of search engine. The first is subjective questions. So if you want to know an objective fact, like Einstein's birthday or something like this, that's pretty easy to find right now in various kinds of online references. But if you want a personal opinion from somebody, if you want relationship advice or career advice, or recommendations about a product you're thinking of buying, something along these lines, your background matters. Your particular context matters. You don't actually want a generic answer. You might not even think of yourself as seeking the right answer. You're seeking an answer that's right for you. You're seeking a subjective answer. And we've noticed that satisfaction ratings for search results are lower for subjective questions than for objective questions. Another class of questions which might motivate investigating a new kind of search engine, natural language questions. It's really nothing short of extraordinary that kind of as a discipline, we've now trained a whole generation of users to translate their thoughts into keywords. That's an unnatural act. It's a linguistic transformation of extraordinary proportions. And it's insufficient. There are a lot of our ideas which cannot easily be put into keywords. There's a lot of our search intent, of our human intent, that's not captured in a few keywords. And when people express their queries in full natural language, well, that's very hard for us to parse with automated systems. And then a third class of questions I'm particularly interested in here are questions that simply don't have answers on the web. The web is, to use our favorite prefixes, ginormous with gabillions of documents and so forth, but it's still only a tiny fraction of all human knowledge. If you think in your own case of everything that you know, of everything that you've ever experienced about your hometown, your feelings about your mother, your favorite foods, where you had lunch yesterday, all of that information, only a tiny fraction of it have you actually authored and put online, even if you're the most prolific tweeter. Most of it isn't online. So we need to say, how can we get that information? Well, this is where you can find that information. It's inside people's heads still. It's locked inside your heads. What if a search engine could help get it out? So with these motivations, thinking about us as overcome with questions that we're not all asking search engine, focusing on these three areas, how could you build a new kind of search engine that would address these classes of questions? So to do that, the approach that we took was really to think about a different conceptual model for what a search engine is. This is the model of the web that traditional search engines have. The web is basically a library. It makes sense that traditional search engines, web search engines, have this view of the web because information retrieval as a field grew out of library sciences. So it's inherited that conceptual model. In the library paradigm for search, you search based on keywords or topics, or in the old days, Dewey Decimal Classification. And what you're searching among is content that has been authored in advance. The search is for an existing answer, and you try to find a keyword that will direct you to tomes that have something like that. This has obviously been enormously successful at transforming the world as we know it, but it's still only one possible model for how to think of the web. Here's another way you could think of the web, a more people-oriented web. Behind every one of those documents online, there are people. There are characters who are all interacting in the real world and who've authored that content. So if you think about the village paradigm for how one does search, as opposed to the library paradigm, well, in the village, knowledge dissemination, it's achieved socially. Information's passed from person to person. So the retrieval task, as it were, is going to find the right person who has the information that you need, instead of finding the right document to answer your question. The challenge, of course, for the village paradigm is that you don't always know who to ask. And maybe you don't have enough friends accessible to you. If you scan down your list of neighbors or your I Am Buddy list, that might not be enough people to answer your question about XMPP libraries or about where to go in Hawaii. Furthermore, it's hard to keep up with what everybody knows. Of all of these people, I don't know who out there is actually a ping pong champion and could advise me about ping pong lessons. And if I did know, there's a social cost in me asking them. We're going to have a conversation. I'm going to have to catch up on everything that's happened since we last talked. They might feel imposed upon and so forth. So while this village paradigm is a great way to distribute information, there are challenges that it faces. So we might think of building a new kind of search engine as a way to use technology to address some of those challenges. So why not build a search engine that is itself social? That is to say, the goal of this search engine is not to find a document, but rather a person to answer your question. And furthermore, a person that you have some social connection to, or some sense of social connection, as we'll talk about later. Real time, and this is key, a search engine that's generating content dynamically, where you're not seeking content that's already been authored, but rather content that will be authored in response to your question, that will be personalized. And lastly, human, where the goal of this search is a connection with another human being. It's not just a document. So the real motivation there is a question originally is an invitation to a human engagement. You're issuing a query to another human being and you want to respond. And so it's only recently we've been trained that a question is an invitation to an engagement with a computer. If we think about our information needs as not just information needs, but also human needs for things like assurance, confidence in how we're going to proceed, we shouldn't neglect the human element. So a search engine based on the village paradigm, I believe, would emphasize these elements. And in fact, even before Aardvark, people are trying to do this type of search already on the web today. Most typically, here's how it happens. On things like Facebook and Twitter and Buzz, people post questions in their status messages, and you hope that a friend might respond. Now, in the true spirit of technology innovation, this is a real hack. Question answering is not what status message systems are optimized to serve. Status message posts are really a kind of public performance. They're an entertainment for your audience. If you don't entertain your audience, you'll cease to have an audience. It's not the appropriate place to ask a quotidian question. If I want to find a dry cleaner near my house, and then I want to find a place to get my shoes fixed, if my Twitter stream for a given day consists of nothing but that, I'll find that my followers shrinks rapidly. And we actually only have a small set of followers who will read our posts compared to all the people who we might be interested in due to social connection, all of our coworkers, all of our classmates, friends of friends, and so forth. If you think of the number of social network friends that you have, if that number's around 200, and they say, well, so I have 40,000 friends of friends. It's an enormous number of people that you want to reach, and a status message isn't an easy way to reach them. But most importantly, a problem with this approach to search is that it wastes everybody's attention. Attention is this resource that's increasingly scarce, and everybody has to read this question, when in fact, maybe you'll get 3 or 4 responses. So that's a problem that we thought we could use technology to help solve. So what we're going to do here is go through a case study of Aardvark in particular, which was a search engine built from the ground up based on those motivations. Aardvark is a live product. It's running now in Google Labs, which is very exciting. The data I'll give today is from when the only time we've publicly released data about Aardvark, which is a paper that Sepp and I wrote at the end of 2009 for the WWW conference. So before talking more, let me just give a demo about, so you can see actually how Aardvark works, how it solves this problem. This is the model that Aardvark takes. You can ask anything to Aardvark. You just send Aardvark a question in plain English, as you would to a friend. And Aardvark's job is to discover the perfect person in your network to answer your question. Aardvark will look through the tens of thousands of people that you're connected to and figure out who might be best to answer and who might be available to answer at the moment. And then it will send those few people your question. If they're not available, or if they say they don't want to answer, Aardvark will move on to the next person. So Aardvark essentially is seeking through everybody you're connected to find an answer and then sending you the answer. Usually you get a personal response in about 5 or 10 minutes. So let's try this out, since we have 5 or 10 minutes to play with. Okay, so here's a web interface to Aardvark. So I'll put in a question. Does anyone know of a great sushi restaurant in San Francisco? And I want to add a little personal context. Someplace that's not too loud on a Friday night. That's tonight. A good place to meet an old friend. So I want somebody to respond to the color of that query. So let me send this into Aardvark here. Great. And so Aardvark is going to look around and find people in my network who are available, who know about sushi in San Francisco, and send them my question. So that should take a few minutes, and meantime, we'll go through some more slides.
Hopefully you're the right person to answer it. So in the status of the thing, so one of the nice things is it is wasteful, but I get 4 people answering, and I get kind of this diversity of opinions. It looks like I'm going to get 1 answer to that question, but I really wanted 4.
Great. So the question is, what's going to happen after I've sent in that question? And am I only going to get 1 answer back? What if I want more opinions? And we'll see what we come up with. But as it happens with Aardvark, there are parameters you can configure to how many answers you're seeking. Maybe at the end we'll have a whole question session here where I or Aardvark takes questions from the audience, and we'll see if we got any answers about sushi. But in the meantime, let me advance here through this. There's a previous question I asked. Let's skip over that, actually, because we have a live question now. And just, I want to point out, for a system like this, since we think of this as a search engine based on the village paradigm, you want to interact with it in the way that you interact with friends ordinarily. So you want to use any of the communication platforms that you would ordinarily use. You can use IM or Twitter. You can come to the web. There's an iPhone app for Aardvark. You can email Aardvark questions. The experience should be very much like asking the person in your network who's the hub, who always knows who to ask for you, the person that you always come to for advice, and they redirect you. Here's a quick example. Some of the kinds of things that people are asking Aardvark is a pretty random selection of just recent queries. Here, on the right, should I wear brown or black shoes with a light brown suit? So subjective questions like that, perennial concern. Above that, he's unqualified to ask that question. Yeah, there's some type of paradox there. somebody's asking above that a prank to play on a supervisor. Again, you maybe want to hear back from people in your social network who would have the same sensibility about pranks. And then interestingly, on the bottom left here, there's a question that says, I have a job interview over lunch tomorrow. Is there any interview restaurant etiquette that I should know? It's kind of an odd thing to post to a status message. It's something you might not want to broadcast out to your 100,000 followers. I'll take questions at the end so I can get through.
Quick one. So the supervisor question, how can I be sure that my supervisor won't see the question?
Great. So the question is about how we can control or how you can be certain that one or another person won't see your question. We can talk through, there are different interfaces that we've developed to show that, but in the current version of Aardvark, there's no control over that in particular. Given that general product interaction, let me talk about the architecture and the algorithms behind it, and I think some of the research challenges necessary to pulling off this kind of search engine. This is obviously just a schematic of the architecture, but to show you the kinds of components, the thing to highlight here is on the far left, there are different gateways, different ways that messages can come into the system and basically get swizzled into a uniform format. And then there's a thing we call a conversation manager. So a social search engine has two interesting kind of responsibilities here. The first is do a little dialogue management. So if you're interacting with a social search engine over IM, there needs to be a little bot mind that knows how to interpret all the commands you're passing it. If you can just type in a question, how does it know it's a question and not an answer to somebody else's question? If you type in a command like, show me my history, it has to recognize that. So part of conversation management is basically being a natural language bot. The other part is chaperoning your question to make sure that it gets an answer. So kind of being mission control for finding all the people who might be relevant, contacting them one by one, seeing if they're responding, moving on to other people, but really organizing the whole episode from you submitting a question to you getting an answer. So that's one key piece of technology. And then another is on the far right, the routing engine. The routing engine's job is to do the actual ranking of candidate answers. So it's very much akin to, in a web search engine, how you have to come up with a ranking of documents in response to a query. We have to come up with a ranking of people in your social network in order of who we think is best to answer the question. I'm going to dive into that a little bit more deeply here and give you kind of a schematic for what that algorithm looks like. Basically, phase it in a few slides. To start with, the way we've modeled this problem of finding the best candidate answers for your question is like this. On the far right, first we need to say, what is the probability that the question that we've received is about a given topic? So we're kind of using topic as an interlingua between questions and candidate answers. So there are various techniques for establishing that term that we can talk about. And secondly, what's the probability that a given user knows about those topics? So in the simplest form, then the probability that a given user can answer a query about is based upon the user's knowledge of the topics that the query is about. The second important term here is that as we're selecting answerers, we don't just want people who know a lot about the subject. We want people who are good answerers for you as an asker, people who are a good match for you. In some ways, this kind of social search engine is an information matchmaking service. We're selling information hookups, if you will, because there's going to be a conversation between you and somebody who replies. We want that to be a satisfying conversation. So in the simplest form, that term looks like this. We compute this based on many factors. This is the probability that a given answer will have a good conversation with, or will give a good answer to, a given asker. The kinds of factors we consider are obviously social connection, since this is social search, common friends and affiliations, but also things like demographic similarity or profile similarity. Do you have common interests? If I'm asking about a movie to go see, do we have common movie favorites and so forth? And other things that you might not think of straight away, such as a kind of a vocabulary match. Do you talk the same way? You know, do you speak the same speak, as it were? Do you fill up your answers with highfalutin vocabulary? Do you use off-color vocabulary? Are you especially chatty? Do you want to have these long expositions of your subject, or just something brief? Are you polite? these kinds of things. How fast are you in going back and forth with somebody else? Those are factors which matter for satisfactory interaction, which are totally independent of whether or not you happen to have knowledge that somebody seeks. So then the final ranking score that we use, minus some business logic, is basically the combination of those two terms. Finding the users that are most likely to be able to answer a question and finding the users who are the best match for the asker. It's a combination of, in that sense, their expertise about the knowledge areas that the question's about and what we call the intimacy or the social connection, the perceived social connection, or like-mindedness between the two people. So then in terms of the operation of the system, to recap, when the routing engine gets a request, it comes up with a bunch of these candidate answerers, passes them to a conversation manager, which will go one by one, seeing if those people can answer until it finds somebody. For those of you like looking at formulas, here are some formulas which have some bearing on the previous slides. We'll talk about those later. And some data. So one of the nice things about Aardvark is it's a live system. It's been running now for over a year. So we want to share some of the statistics that we found, some of the metrics that we found in actually running this and releasing it in the wild. So first, and this is, I think, the first most surprising thing, that answers are reasonably fast. Almost 90% of questions get an answer. And over half of those happen in less than 10 minutes. Now, that's kind of extraordinary, because you might be thinking, as you sit there, with whatever you're perseverating over right now, your problem, that you're alone doing that. But actually, somewhere in the tens of thousands of people that you know, somebody could answer and would be happy to answer right now. So that's, I think, a stunning first discovery about releasing something like this in the wild. Question is then, okay, are they any good, these answers? Now, we think they're good because we built the system, but there's some interesting questions about how you actually measure that. Intuitively, there are different proxies you can use. The answer length, so that the median answer length is about 24 words, is interesting. These aren't typically one-word answers that people give. And then there's also explicit feedback that users give. Users have the option to say, that was a good answer, that was okay, or that was bad. And when they give feedback, 70% rate the question as good. It's always hard to know what to make of explicit feedback numbers, but I'll say something interesting about this number is that it correlates with another implicit signal, which is how often an asker responds to the answerer afterwards and says thanks or asks a follow-up question. In other words, how often does the asker think it's worth their time to follow up? And that number, as we make changes in the system, tends to vary, tends to correlate with explicit feedback. Another interesting stat is that the questions we get are, in fact, quite long. They're almost 19 words compared to about 2.5 words, which is average for web search queries. So that means that there's a much clearer specification of intent and personal context, what matters to you. And indeed, as designed, the questions are often subjective. So here's kind of a pie chart of the kinds of things people ask about. And nearly 65% of the questions have some kind of subjective element in them. I'm looking for a good restaurant or some subjective marker. The distribution you see here across verticals isn't entirely dissimilar from what you see in web search, but then they tend to be subjective questions within those verticals. And then I also want to point out an interesting stat about user activity. There's a really broad range of answerers in the Aardvark system. 75% of users who've interacted with Aardvark at all have given an answer. Now, that's remarkable for a user-generated content site that you have such broad participation on something like Yahoo Answers or a bulletin board style site. Usually the number is about 25%. And part of that is because we're actually reaching out actively and finding the right person at the right moment to respond. I'll also say that within a month of when we released our iPhone app, we were at 3.5 sessions per month on that, which is contrasted with, at the time, it was about 5.5 sessions per month for web search. So immediately, a lot of usage on mobile. Now, apart from that data, I also want to share some more qualitative learnings. We do a lot of, our team does a lot of user research, and every week has people coming in and sharing their experiences with the product. And that's been going on for the past, for as long as the product's been live. So apart from what you can learn from the stats, you learn a lot of interesting things in these interviews, and those really inform the design of the next generation of the product. Here's some of the principles that we've learned. With any search site, people want to know whether they can trust their answer. What we found is that, for the most part, the sense of trust comes simply from assessing the textual interaction you have with the other person. There isn't an explicit reputation system in Aardvark or some type of score of how good the answer is. Rather, what we're doing is we're taking a real-world interaction, just two people talking one-on-one, and we're saying, in the same way that you assess somebody that you're talking to in the real world, assess this answer. We find that, therefore, it's very important to have a sense of intimacy around that answer. When I'm broadcasting a public answer for people, I have all sorts of different motivations, right? I'm grandstanding in a sense. Whereas if I'm just talking to you one-on-one, you can look me in the virtual digital eyes, as it were, and say, what is my motivation to mislead? It's a very inefficient spam channel, a one-on-one conversation. So we find that intimacy is what most facilitates trust, not a reputation system. Another interesting thing that we found is that Aardvark users are most satisfied when their conversation feels social, even if it's not actually a conversation with a friend. The feeling of this being social search comes from, well, are other friends of yours using the system in general? Can we cite the name of somebody who's a friend of a friend of a friend? It's really a pretty distant connection if you're talking to a friend of a friend of a friend, but yet to be able to think of it that way, that you're somehow connecting to them, makes you open to receiving the answer. Similarly, affiliations work that way. Fellow alumni from Stanford or something. There's quite a few of them, but still, I'm more curious than about just a random anonymous post I find somewhere. This is particularly interesting and relates to why people really participate in Aardvark. The most effective channel we have for receiving answers from people is actually through IM. And what happens is you're sitting there killing time at work at your desk, and suddenly a little IM pops up that says, hey, are you there? A friend of Damon's has a question about the future of technology that I think you might be able to answer. Well, what's interesting about this is users love getting these. It's a little compliment, a little flattery, and also it's totally optional. You don't have to do anything. You can just ignore it. You can type pass. Nobody knows that you saw it. It's an invitation to interact with somebody if you want to. If you want to take 30 seconds and write down your thoughts about something, you can help somebody right then. And if you don't, you don't have to. So what's interesting is it's a bot that contacts you, and yet 60% of the time when people receive this bot, this invitation to engage, they respond in some way. They give an answer, or they pass. They say, not this one, but something else, or they refer to a friend. They don't just ignore it, which is remarkable. It's just a bot popping up. Another key feature here in terms of this being social software is that, as we talked about with the village, there is a real social cost to just reaching out directly and asking somebody for help. Somebody that I've met twice in a few meetings here, and then I want to ask them some hard question. That's an imposition. That's a burden, and I don't want to spend social capital in doing that. So if I can send my question to Aardvark, and then Aardvark is going to reach out, I'm not spending any social capital in getting the answer. And similarly, for the answerer, it's beneficial to have this intermediation because the answerer isn't rejecting anybody. Nobody knows. If I decide, somebody asks me a question about Aardvark and I'm just not in the mood, that seems like an affront if that happens in real life. But with this intermediation, there's plausible deniability, and I just pass on the question. I don't respond. And then lastly, I often get this inquiry of why, how are we getting these answers? Just like we don't have a reputation system, we also don't have any kind of point system. You're not racking up virtual points and because of all the answers that you've given. Rather, people are giving answers simply because of altruism, outright goodwill. It is very hard to find somebody who doesn't enjoy helping other people in the right context. It's very hard to find somebody who doesn't take pride in the fact that they gave somebody, good advice about their career or help somebody with directions on the street. The catch is, what are the opportunities to do that? Is it the right time? So a lot of what we're trying to do is engineer interactions where your latent helpfulness comes out. Now, something else I want to point out here is if we're really leaning on altruism as the motivator for people interacting with Aardvark, that actually means we have to avoid other kinds of motivators because those can interfere with altruism being the main effect. So for instance, if there are other perks that we offer to people like fame or leadership on a bulletin board, then altruism ceases to be an active motivator, kind of drug interaction effects in a way with incentive systems. So we're actually sticking with optimizing goodwill as our fuel source for tapping people. Now, the last major section I want to talk through here is research challenges involved with this, because this paradigm for social search is a new paradigm, and we think there's huge opportunity for it and huge challenges. And so I'm really interested in getting this audience interested in helping to address some of these research challenges. I'll go through just a few of them. We already covered the ranking function, and there's been a lot of work on ranking functions for web search. I hope we could have some approximation of that amount of work for ranking functions for social search engines. Next, a big problem is how we derive this term, the poorly formatted term there on the side, which is how we know what a user knows about. What topics how we find out somebody's expertise. From a product level, there are a number of channels for doing this. People can explicitly declare what they know about. Friends can say what they trust other friends about. We can import structured profiles and so forth. But there's also a research challenge, which is really from unstructured web content, for instance, from status messages and blogs. How do you extract expertise? The approach that we've taken to that at Aardvark is to index people based upon their pre-existing web content, essentially. So when people point us to their blog or to their Twitter account, we want to model the user as a content generator. You want to say, what kind of content have they generated in the past? And that gives you some prediction of the kind of content they're likely to generate in the future with respect to topics. So at the far end of the spectrum, the whole web of documents becomes just an index, actually, of the people that authored that. We're not really interested in the documents in the first place for this type of social search. We can go through some details later about the techniques we use, but that's the general research area. Now, this is also a really interesting research area. Is what do we do with the question that we get? Note that the problem here is not the problem of natural language understanding, or really understanding what the question's about, or even automated question answering. We just have to know enough about the question in order to direct it to the right people. Now, there are also some special challenges that we face. A question is a very small text snippet. As opposed to classifying a whole document, you need different approaches to classification for a small snippet. And also, if we're classifying into an enormous space and a growing space of user topical expertise, that's difficult. If you need to have millions and millions of classifiers, there's some challenges around that. One of the nice things about this type of paradigm, however, for developing these algorithms is that it's possible to get online feedback immediately from users. So if I submit a question about finding a sushi restaurant in San Francisco, and the system comes back with something unlike finding a sushi restaurant in San Francisco, so perhaps it says, oh, well, here's something about friendship, because I was asking about bringing a friend to a restaurant. I can immediately correct that as a user. I can say that's the wrong tag to put on this question. And then that's learning data, basically, for the next generation of the system. There are different learning models that can take advantage of that. So while there's kind of a traditional component to some of those previous research challenges, there are entirely new things that arise with this paradigm. One we've dubbed the answerer economy problem, which is, if you think of social search as a market where there are information seekers and information providers, well, we're particularly concerned with the providers and making sure that there are enough people available who will answer your question. We model it by thinking about how to maximize the amount of answerer resource that's available. That is, the number of people available and how much answering they're willing to do about what subjects. And then how to make optimal usage of that answering resource. That involves changing parameters such as how many answers we're seeking for a user, how aggressive we are. Would we contact a few people at a time or only one person at a time? And also when you spend different resources. If I have a neuroscience expert, I'm thinking, well, maybe I'm not going to spend him on this sushi restaurant question if I have a lot of sushi restaurant experts. And so there are all sorts of challenges there. And then lastly, I think there are real challenges around interaction design that are research challenges. Because of the things we've discovered, the importance of social intermediation, the importance of creating trust through intimacy, the importance of etiquette matching between users. Those are things where interaction design can help quite a lot. Lastly, there's, of course, research to be done just in the effectiveness of this paradigm. So we're excited. It's just been out recently, but now we're already starting to see people who are doing explicit evaluations of Aardvark-style social search versus web search, or versus status message question asking to measure its effectiveness. And The top one is the first thesis that's been written on Aardvark, which is always a milestone. If I'm not the one who wrote the thesis, but somebody else did, independent party. And we're delighted to find that actually the results in early studies are very consistent with what we'd expect, which is to say, for subjective questions, Aardvark-style social search is more effective, yields higher satisfaction scores, and is faster than objective web search. Whereas for objective question, web search clearly dominates. So since that's all been sunshine and roses, I want to bring up the other side of the coin. The system does make technical errors. Here's a case of routing a question to a user who doesn't think of themselves as an expert, maybe, on this subject. And then there are also interaction design challenges. This is information matchmaking. Things can go wrong. So here's the interaction. It's a little hard to read there, but somebody asks, are only blood relatives in the state of Michigan allowed to claim children on their taxes? Somebody replies, I'm not sure. Why don't you check with a tax expert, not a web service? The asker says, well, that's a little rude, don't you think? Just a simple question. I'm wondering it late at night. I want to know if somebody knew. You don't have to be rude, and on and on. So, so that's a failure of the system. Just as you could have a failure in ranking, there's a failure of the system in terms of how do you structure an interaction to minimize the occurrences of these. That said, those are rare occurrences. And for the most part, what we see are really extraordinary positive examples. So just to read through a transcript of what somebody happened, here's somebody asking, what's a good place to take a spunky, off-the-cuff, social, pretty girl for a non-traditional, fun, memorable dinner date in San Francisco? There's a lot of context in that question, a lot of flavor, a lot of color. And look at the different answers we get. The first one, within 4 minutes, there's an answer about 2 different suggestions with brief summaries. And then, interestingly, 6 minutes later, somebody says, hey, we'll take her to this production of Tommy and the Mission, best show I've seen. Now, that's not what was asked, but it's relevant information. A human was able to interpret the question and say, you know what, this could be useful at this moment. And indeed, the asker was thrilled with that and said, oh, cool. And then 10 minutes later, another answer with all sorts of detail about the ambiance at a restaurant, whether it would fit. These are the kind of things that are just very hard to get, these sorts of experiences in web search, when what you really want is just a simple human conversation. So that's all I want to cover. Thanks, everybody. We'll take some questions here. Oh, of course. Let's see what we got. All right, let me go see. I hope I'm hungry. Go see if I have any answers. I have an answer. Sushi Zone. Yelp it. That's appropriate. All right. Resubmit. Oh, there's more? Terrific. Sorry. PC. No. So there's one answer so far to that question. We'll see what we get by the end of the answer period. Great. Yeah, other questions.
I've got sort of 3 short questions, if I may. And the first one is, have you considered using the answers to previous questions as answers, or would that detract from the social nature of the search?
Great.
Is Aardvark available on Android phones? Because I can't find it in Marketplace. And the third one is the leveraging the previous information about users' expertise. I'm thinking about this in the context of enterprise search, but it seems to me like email archives may be a fantastic source of that kind of knowledge. And we did some work on using email archives for actually question answering in companies at one point, and it was indeed an incredibly valuable resource. So
great.
It's kind of comment the last thing. But.
So I'll take those from shortest to longest. There's not an Android app. We'd like to change that, but I can't make any specific product promises. As for how we use people's different kinds of web history, we're looking at all sorts of different sources of data. Any content that you've generated, whether on Aardvark or an email or web search, if you want to share that with Aardvark, if you want to say, hey, instead of me telling you, Aardvark, what I know about, I want you to just learn it from these data sources, we want to be able to do that. And then to the first point that you asked, which is about, well, do we kind of reuse answers? I think the short answer is no. We don't do that. And the reason why we didn't do that with our first product release is that the beachhead is really setting up live conversations between people. That's the model that we want people to understand. We want them to see that there's this opportunity. It's not obvious that there's this opportunity, that you could have that conversation with people. And it becomes less obvious if you're saying, oh, I'm just going to browse through existing answers. So there's ways to, so there's a trade-off. There are ways to make use of that content, but I think the trade-off against the interaction paradigm isn't worth it. You had a question? There. Yeah.
Thank you for the talk. So you both framed your presentation initially, and then also showed some research results that are now coming in that make the distinction between search engines and Aardvark. I'm wondering, has there been any data? Have you looked into the kind of closer comparison between Aardvark question answering and other online question answering sites that keep answers around, that are more vertical in topic? Do you have a sense of differences in performance and also differences in the kind of questions that are well served by one versus the other?
Great. So I'll make just two quick comments about other classes of what you might call social search, which is maybe the bulletin board style kind of class of solutions, and then the status message class. Actually, I guess we already covered the status message kind of question asking already, and different applications that can be built on top of Buzz or Twitter or Facebook to optimize that. And again, I think the real issue there is one of entertaining your followers. It's the performative issue. And there's no system that's kind of looking out to get you answers. And so what's been found, Morris, previous slide, there's a reference. Morris had done some results and found that one of the challenges with status message asking is, kind of the inability to kind of have an interaction or refinement of your query when somebody gives you an answer one-on-one with them, to be able to go back and forth, and the speed issues. Relative to bulletin board systems, I guess the most important thing I think that we've observed is the participation rate. Something that tends to happen with the bulletin board system is there's a small number of people who basically troll the site and will kind of rack up a lot of answers. It'll either be, it tends to be either kind of teenagers, or the people who built the system for the early audiences. And so that's a challenge. Is how do you get past that? How do you get broader participation? I think there might be some ways to have hybrids between Aardvark-style search and those systems. But I think there are going to be more reports coming out in the coming months, I think, about those comparisons. Yeah.
There was actually one really interesting finding out of Meredith's paper, which was that when you ask a question on Facebook, the average time to answer that question was 15 minutes, whereas for Aardvark it's 6 minutes. And so it's actually quite surprising, given that with Facebook you're blasting it out to all of your friends, and Aardvark blasts it only to a few other people. And a lot of the reason why is because you do it to people who are available and have expertise.
Great point. Great.
Vince Cerf. I have a couple of questions. First of all, have you bumped into something called chat roulette by any chance?
Great question. I haven't.
Actually, the reason I bring it up is that I was impressed by the intervention that Aardvark provides, whereas chat roulette is sort of literally in your face. So this is a more socially adept design, I think. The idea that you have accumulated answers to a bunch of questions does suggest an opportunity. I think it was suggested earlier that you accumulate that and make it usefully searchable in addition to using this conversational paradigm. The last thing I'm wondering about is if you were to do that, if you could capture not only the text of the question and the answer, but the other indicia that said this person is a likely respondent. If you keep all that information along with it, you could compute what some of the answers, what's the ranking of the previous answers that might be relevant to a question that just got asked. So there's, you have an opportunity to make the body of accumulating information increasingly useful and relevant, I think.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great point. Something that arises because it's not simply a set of documents, but we have interaction data that goes with it. The interaction data is signals about the nature of the content, which then can be used for informing further routing or all sorts of applications. Great point.
What percentage of questions gets answered by your social network versus bumped to everybody?
Great. So the question is, what percentage of questions get answered by your social network as opposed to everybody? Now, with a set of people using Aardvark, the way it worked is we'd start with your immediate friends, and if we didn't find somebody who we thought was a good answer, then friends of friends, and friends of friends of friends, and then affiliations and so forth. So we kind of go outwards, and you can get several hops down. So there's not. So in some sense, there can be people who are total random strangers, but that's a small number when we go through all the hops. I can look up and try to find a number for you, but I don't have one offhand. Yeah. Right. So the question, yeah. Great. So two questions. One is kind of where does the social network data come from, and the second is what about relationships that are future relationships that you haven't formed yet? How does Aardvark relate to that? So on the first point, this is a social search engine. It's not actually a social network product, and so it just sits on top of any social information that can be found, whether that's Facebook social graph, Google social graph through contacts or Buzz, Twitter, and so forth. So it's the aggregate of all of those things, and as we move towards more openness about social graph information, a social search engine can sit on top of that. So it's a somewhat different function. Now, it is true. There are people who have formed relationships through Aardvark. A friend of a friend of a friend answers, and you say, "Thanks for that answer." It turns out that we both have this common interest. They exchange contact information, and nuptials, to come. It's not the main use case, but it has happened. Good. Great. Yeah. One question there.
I'm interested in how you might know people's ages and what's the breakdown. Are there, you mentioned teenagers. Are there any younger than teenagers on there, and what's the interaction between people that are younger and older?
Good question. Some really fascinating stuff happened there. There's just in terms of use issues about letting on people under 13 and the different brackets and so forth, which we followed. And the greatest, I think, most interesting demographic information there came from releasing an iPhone app. And when we did that, that was when we actually got a huge influx of teenagers. And we found that a lot of the questions teenagers were asking, a lot of the people in their 20s to 60s were less interested in answering. Maybe they'd answered for themselves or realized there were no answers to those questions. Now, our strategy for dealing with that is the same as our strategy for dealing with any question that might not have a universal appeal, which is to match like with like. It turns out that if you kind of have a head full of steam as a 17-year-old boy and you're asking questions that reflect the surge of hormones and so forth, there are other people in that age group that are really interested in answering those. So instead of a paternalistic approach that says we don't allow this kind of content on Aardvark, it was much more find other people who ask those kinds of questions. And again, that's, I think, a research challenge. We call it etiquette matching, but
so are you thinking about having a T version of Aardvark versus or just having it under the hood?
So it has been under the hood to date, and that's actually been fairly effective. I do think that there are ways in terms of marketing a product or educating users about it that can be helpful to have separate branding, but in terms of the actual matching, it's been under the hood. Great. Okay. Thanks again, everybody.